I'm Kathy Baldock. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit ministry based in Reno, Nevada called Canyon Walker Connections. And I'm probably a lot like many people that have gone through this journey before. In 2001, I was completely non-affirming. And what affirming means is that you would be sexual orientation, gender identity blind within a space. So it doesn't matter to me what someone's now, it doesn't matter to me what your sexual orientation is or your gender identity is. I believe in absolute inclusion and equality within faith environments. And where I work mostly is within conservative faith environments. I have been a born-again Christian since 1983. I was raised Roman Catholic in the Irish Catholic section of New York, the top of Manhattan. I was born in '56, makes me a lovely 62. And a lot of these things matter because they become parts of the story and the filters through which I see. So I was raised in New York City as a Roman Catholic. After college, I ended up in Seattle and then down in Reno. And in 2001, I started going through a divorce that I didn't want. And the way I chose to cope with that, I didn't want to do, like a lot of people do, like revenge adultery. I didn't want to do that. So what I did was I decided to keep my mind active and my body active by two different things. I took an Italian class at a community college. Languages are the most difficult thing intellectually I can do. I am just not gifted. I can do, menu Greek and menu Italian, but languages are quite difficult. So I started taking Italian classes, and I started hiking every day. And the hiking part, I live within 10 minutes of about 24 hiking trails. I live 17 minutes from Lake Tahoe, so I live in a fabulous spot in the high mountain desert, over a mile high, so it's wonderful. And I chose to take all of that pain and disappointment and take it out on hiking trails. And while I was out on the hiking trail, I ran into a woman that seemed to be hiking just as much as I was, and I finally decided to ask her, if I could hike with her. What really was the truth was it was a Saturday morning, and it was a particularly crappy day at home. And I was just not coping well. And I was not allowed to tell my children that we were going through a divorce, so it was a pain I had to carry myself. And my husband demanded that I also not tell my closest friends. And, I knew that was sort of a reality because sometimes in Christian circles you can raise a prayer request, well, you might as well get on the horn and tell everybody. Did you hear Kathy Baldock? We must pray for her. She's going through a terrible... No, honey, I told you not to tell anybody. Thank you very much. But, so I didn't tell anybody. So I was going through this very difficult space in my life. And I saw the same woman that I'd seen on the trails many times. And I literally said to her, would you mind if I turned around and walked with you for a while? She's my best friend. So all these many years later, 18 years later, she is everything I'm not. She's a woman of color. She has a Hispanic last name. She's a Native American, and she's a lesbian. But for the first year, she wouldn't tell me she was a lesbian because it was pretty clear that I was a Christian because everybody that gets around me got to know I was a Christian. It's one of those evangelical Christians with the gift of evangelism. Yeah, that's the one. In some circles, that would be wonderful, like when we had our MOPS meetings, you bring your unsaved neighbor to the Christmas brunch, and you sit your unsaved neighbor next to me. By the time, the dessert was being served, they were laying on the floor, they'd gone through all the spiritual laws, they were now in heaven, thank you, Kathy Baldock. So for me not to say anything to her was quite a challenge to what's natural to me, but I was going through a divorce. So I didn't think, although I never had a crisis of faith, I didn't think I had anything to export, right? So I couldn't say, it was kind of clear the very first time I hiked with her, she had a big old white truck with a kayak rack on the top and rainbow stuff hanging from her rearview mirror. And I thought, oh, I think this person might be a lesbian. So, but I didn't want to push it because I didn't want to feel obligated to have to tell her what she needed to do and how she needed to change. So I did something unbelievably unusual for me. I just did relationship without telling her what she needed to do. That was rather wise. And then first night of Italian class. This was all within weeks of each other. I had gone to a women's retreat. This is not what I planned on saying, but it's a very funny story. I'd gone to a women's retreat, and I knew something was stirring in me that I was supposed to take a direction. Well, all these years during marriage, during the struggle of marriage, I was just this, knew I had a message, knew I could write, knew I could speak, and I was positive God was going to heal this very difficult marriage. And I was going to be on every stage throughout the country telling people, well, you don't have it so bad, honey, look how God healed us. Didn't happen. But I knew there was something stirring in me that I had a message, didn't know what it was, but it started to become very clear that gay people were like dropping out of the rainbows into my life. And so at the end of the women's retreat, I don't particularly like women's retreats anymore, sorry. And but at the end of this one, everybody had cried and shared their stories. And at the end of this particular one, I thought, I'm just going to get up and say what I want to say. Yeah, there should be a filter. But I stood up and they said, everybody's crying and crying. And I stood up there and I said, God's doing something in my life. And I don't know what he's doing in my life. And I said, but there seems to be a lot of gay people in my life. And I'm tired of explaining and validating why I have relationships with so many gay people. And so I said, I don't really give a rat's ass what any of you think about me anymore because it's apparent that God must be doing something. So I put both my hands up and I said, so bring it on. Within 3 weeks, I had Netto in my life, and in my Italian class, the very first night I was partnered up with the only gay man in class, Tom Durante, who's still one of my closest friends, went to dinner with him 2 weeks ago. And these were the first two people in my life that ever told me they were gay. I was 40-something, and nobody had ever told me they were gay. I'd gone to a very big university. I went to Rutgers University in the 70s. I did sports all the way through college. I ran track. So I shared the locker room with the girls' softball team and the girls' basketball team. There were probably a few lesbians floating around. But even at that time, I would have said they had a sexual preference. I wouldn't have seen it as an orientation in the 70s. So it was kind of startling to have two people within 3 weeks come out to me that I liked. So I shut my mouth. I shut my mouth and I did relationship with them. And within a year, I started figuring out that they deserved their civil rights. I wasn't so sure about this Bible stuff, but they deserved their civil rights. And that I didn't deal with the verses. It took me 5 years to go see what the Bible said about it. I was sure I knew, but I couldn't have told you where in the Bible it said the thing I was so sure about, but I knew it was in there. I'd been told for so many years in the evangelical church that it was in there. So I finally took the time. We had a particularly huge snowstorm in the Sierra. The place I was working for, a technology company, shut down for a week. And I decided each day to take one of those verses and do whatever I could to figure out what those verses meant to me. So at the end of each of those days, I actually went out, was snowshoeing in my neighborhood because I couldn't even get out of my neighborhood. And after I figured out what I thought the Bible was saying to me, I snowshoed around my neighborhood almost every afternoon after that, during this process, and cried. Because I thought, these people that I've come now to love, I was wrong, or I think I'm wrong, about what the Bible says. But also, so as I started going through this process, and then in 2006, I saw an article in the New York Times about the Gay Christian Network. So I thought I did something odd. And I went to the Gay Christian Network's conference in Seattle that year. I was the first straight person to ever go to the GCN conference. But it was the first night, and I saw 200 LGBT, no, there were no T's, LGB Christians worshiping God, and I was very convicted. I knew that they were worshiping the same God. So then I had to start struggling with my theology. So as I struggled with my theology, I just let this happen, this process happen. And I would try to talk to people about LGBTQ Christians. And I got involved with a church, Freedom in Christ Church, evangelical church, a gay church in San Francisco. They were very gracious to me. They allowed me to come into their lives, to all the barbecues, etc. And a very wise Christian gay man said, Kathy, don't talk for us, don't speak for us, just learn who we are. And so I spent 2 years just trying to understand my gay friends, because I think a big mistake a lot of straight allies make, and they still make, and when they make them, I would just want to just, oh my gosh, stop. Make it about themselves. And I was trying to find the right balance of this thing, and then, so I started to think about a book. And as I start, and the typical book was going to be coming out of my head, and the book was going to be, I used to be really ugly too, then I met some gay people, then I went through the scriptures, here's what they really mean, here's some really nice gay people, don't you want to be just like me? What a compelling story. Never been told before. So I sat down to write the book, and that's not what happened. What happened was I kept asking the question, why are people not listening to me when I say, Jesus says to love people, Jesus wouldn't do this? It was not working. The scriptures were not working on people, and telling people that they should love everybody wasn't working, which is pretty funny, actually, right? I mean, this is the principles of Christianity. And so I started asking and answering the questions that made sense to me. And the questions that were making sense to me were, I'm very inquisitive. So how did that happen? How did that happen? How did that happen? How did that happen? And that's how the book happened. It ended up being a history book about how did that happen? How did that happen? So I started writing the book. Oh, the book. I wrote a book. I always forget. I wrote a book. So it's Walking the Bridges Canyon. It's 450 pages of really good information. And I'm really proud that it has 500 footnotes in it. And it's well-researched, and a discussion guide that goes along with it. So there you go. I wrote a book. And then I was trying to think about how to communicate what was in the book. And anything good. Did you put a picture? Oh, that's Netto. See? That's Netto. So we just finished the 168-mile loop around Lake Tahoe, the Tahoe Rim Trail, and I want you to specifically notice that my backpack is far bigger than Netto's backpack. See, I carried the bear canister and the tent and a few other things, because she said, I am not going backpacking with you. It's like, oh, there she is. So I can be convincing. So, it's a good trait to have. So this method came out of just trying to be able to communicate this. So what I'm going to do over the next 2 days is I'm going to lift people out of their bubbles, out of their safe zones, and I'm going to lift you high, and I'm going to let you look on this great span of history and look down on these things that maybe are problematic for you or that you never understood, and then I'm going to let you see this foundational truth about history, and then I'm going to take, and not that I do not respect the Bible as a sacred document, but I'm going to take the Bible as a historical document, and I'm going to lay it back on those foundational principles. And so that we can discover together what those verses actually mean in truth. And when you see how, by the end of tomorrow, I hope that you'll be able to look back and you'll be able to see that this anti-gay theology is a very new thing. It probably only really started in the 80s. So we have retrofitted scripture and created a theology, and it's not that old, and if it's not that old, it probably can be undone with some foundational truths. So that's the goal of this, and we are going to start 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago is the beginning of patriarchy. I'm not going to get into how old is the earth. That's a whole nother video, and actually I'm planning on doing one because I have to deal with those scriptures, to deal with Genesis 1 and 2, to talk about the trans community. In this presentation, I'm not going to step into that, because to do a respectful, good, academic, well-researched job on that, I have to deal with Genesis 1 and 2, because those are the verses used against the gay community. It used to be Deuteronomy 22:5, men shall not dress in the clothes of women. But when I started in this work 10 years ago, that was the proof text. Nobody uses that one anymore. Now they're back to Genesis 1 and 2. The line just keeps moving. So I'm not going to engage the conversation on the trans community. That'll come another time. So for those that are here or watching, it's not that I am not aware. I have well over 100 trans friends. Love them dearly. One is like a sister to me. Hello, Lisa, love you to death. And I do love her to death. So I'm going to be talking about the LGB group. So 12,000 years ago, patriarchy. So there were probably around 5 million people on the planet, and they started combining up into tribes and bands, and they would be bands of about 150 people, things like that, and they started to settle into an area and start to grow crops. So they had domesticated animals, they started to grow crops. This is the agrarian revolution, which changed the way things were done. People were traveling around before in bands and tribes. Now they stayed put. And the women tended to stay put, tend to the crops and the children, and the men went out and got the meat. So the meat became a huge commodity. And when the meat came back into the village, that became kind of a trading tool for people. So whoever got the most meat would be able to trade with other families, and whoever really got the most meat ended up with the most power in an environment too. So it really was a thing of whoever brings home the bacon gets the power. And there are a lot of theories, but this is the strongest one that anthropologists say is it was based on the men going off and getting the meat and the commodities. And yes, there are matriarchies, there are egalitarian cultures. I'm not dealing with those because the prevailing social organizational system throughout history has been patriarchy. Patriarchy is where the men have the intellectual, the government, the money, the social control, and they are the dominant within the culture. So patriarchy's been entrenched for 12,000 years. So that's quite a long time, and I will tell you, when we started engaging and trying to cut patriarchy out of the culture was about here. So when it looks in the mid-1950s, the second feminist push. So before that, when you think about how many years how many centuries patriarchy has been entrenched, you can understand why the stress exists within the culture to resist sharing the power. Okay? Everything within the view of the world was seen through agrarian eyes, because this is the culture they knew. So a man planted his seed within a woman. She was a fertile planting ground. You can think of the creation stories. You can think of all of those and to know that this was part of their agrarian culture, the lens through which they saw. And women, the only essential part women have been in creation until 1870. We didn't know until 1870 that it took an egg and a sperm to make a baby. So through all of history, men have thought that that stuff inside of their white stuff was an entire human being, and that all he had to do was put that into a fertile planting ground and you got a human. So this is going to make sense, because if the man has all the stuff to make a human being, the man can't waste that stuff, he can't put it in the wrong orifice, and he can't put it in the wrong place or waste it, because that would be morally wrong and essentially sinful eventually. Okay? So a seed not placed in a woman would have been destroyed. So women did not have the status that men had. So to put a man in the sexual role of a woman, to penetrate a man, was to make him take the social too and sexual role of a woman. So penetrating another man or a male was like weaponizing sex. Totally different view than it is today. So when men would go into an area and they would conquer or they would take over another group, it would be quite common that they would also rape the men to put them into the place of a woman. All of this is going to make sense, because where I'm going with it is all through history, these are the words you're going to hear constantly, is patriarchy, penetration, and procreation. They're all tied together. So we can even say, so women have been problematic since the beginning of time. Even the Greeks, and especially when we started educating them, the story, the Greek creation, so Eve in the Christian creation story is the person that brings evil into the world, right? By inviting the doubts of the serpent. But even the Greeks have a creation story that dates 8,000 years ago, where Zeus locked all of the information of the universe in a box, and nosy, curious, disobedient Pandora went and unlocked that box, and when she unlocked it, Zeus came down and tried to flip the lid really fast, and thank goodness the only thing that didn't get out of that box was hope. But evil escaped in the world through a woman. Lots of stories and myths have to do with women behaving badly to bring evil into the world. And then we have some church fathers. From the 2nd century, we have Tertullian, and one of my favorite quotes. He says, "A woman's vagina is a temple built over a sewer." So, if you've seen vagina monologues, this is a line you have not seen in it, heard in it. "The vagina is a gateway to the devil. Woman, you are the devil's doorway." It gets worser. We're only starting here. "It was your fault that the Son of God had to die. You should always go around in mourning and rags." Okay. Aristotle in the 4th century, he thought that a woman was an infertile male, and that when a woman had a menstrual period, it was actually failed semen coming out of her, and a woman was actually a defective male. Okay? So the way you unfortunately got a baby daughter is if the hot of a man couldn't overcome the cool of a woman, then you were cursed with a baby girl. But if the hot of a man did overcome the cool of a woman, then you got a baby boy. So it was a man struggling against a woman. Women were seen, and they're going to be seen this way through history. So what I'm doing is laying this foundation of women are not so desirable to be. Okay? Women were seen as temptresses, causing men to sexually fall. They were also to blame when something went wrong in childbirth. So breech baby, any kind of thing goes wrong in childbirth, and if you ended up, through the 1870s, if you ended up with a baby with, we would call ambiguous genitalia, through the 1870s they called those babies monsters. We call them intersex people. Okay? But you got an intersex baby when the woman did something wrong. Okay? So she did something wrong by having excess lust and tempting the man. So it was typically a woman that was at fault. In the 4th and 5th centuries, we have Christian views of sex begin to form under St. Augustine. He was really an interesting guy. Okay? So 1,500 years ago, and he becomes the basis for a lot of Christian sexual ethics, a lot of Christian ethics, Catholic ethics. So he spent his early years being a bit of a man whore. He wasn't a Christian. He lived with women. He lived with older women. He had several children. And he left them and went on to another woman, had children. Well, his mother was a bit aristocratic and was not very pleased with him. So she said, we're done with this behavior. You go off and you take care of this stuff and you think about this for a while. And as he went off, he became a Christian. So his mother betrothed the perfect bride for him, but she was only 10 when he got betrothed to her, so he had to wait 2 more years until she was of marriageable age. Okay? Through much of history, and I may be putting this in the wrong place in my head, it may have to come up again later, but at the turn of the century, in most of the United States, the age of consent was 12 years old. Because basically through history, men have been able to do with their bodies what they want to do. And everybody, it didn't matter what was at the end of his penis, as long as he was the one penetrating, all is good in manland, right? So Augustine then gets God and starts thinking about Christian ethics, and he becomes very stoic in his ethics. And Stoicism, this will come up again in Romans, Stoicism says that sex needs to be procreative. It needs to be sexually procreative. It needs to have male dominance, which means the male penetrating, and it means to have self-control. So he starts placing those values into Christian ethics about sex. And I often say this because I think it's a very funny line. It's very funny that, oh, is he the one? Maybe it's not him. I'll get there. Oh, I think it's somewhere else. It's very. I'll have to let you laugh later. So any sex that is non-male penetrative, not procreative, and lust-filled is wrong. So we're at least talking about ancient cultures, 1,500 years ago, but we're going to see that that same principle is going to carry till about the beginning of the 20th century. It's pretty surprising how how long these ethics stay in place. And actually, it was I can't remember the name of this Catholic theologian. He's saying, like, it is time to rethink these things, because it's St. Augustine 1,500 years ago that gave us these Christian sexual ethics, and he calls this the long shadow of St. Augustine's penis. I mean, it's just like, this has gone on long enough, 1,500 years. It's time to reassess these things. So he also blamed, I speak plainly, not crudely. You can't talk about this topic without saying certain things that are ridiculous, because I want you to understand how ridiculous to us some of these views are. He also blamed, he didn't want to take any responsibility for being tempted. Remember, it's the women that are the temptresses. We're going to see this when we look at the 1 Corinthians verse, because the word is associated with the way women behave. And he says that it is the devil, it is Satan in the woman that is making his penis come to an erection. It's not his thoughts. So even his own erections are the fault of a woman and the devil in them tempting him. Everything was the fault of the woman. Any bad behavior was the fault of the women. Men didn't take responsibility for these things. So ancient Greeks and Latin languages don't have a word for homosexual. They don't have this word. If you tried to use the word homosexual probably before this time in history, around the 1930s, you're going to get a completely different understanding of what homosexual is. We're going to see that when we look through psychoanalytics and psychology. So to try to use the word homosexual within a biblical context makes no sense, because same-sex eroticism within ancient cultures have a completely different place than we have it now. Sex and pleasure were not linked, not necessarily linked, but sex and domination were. Okay? Sex and domination, not sex and marriage. Sex and marriage starts getting, at least love and marriage start getting linked in the mid-1800s, and sex and marriage starts getting linked for Christians in the 1970s, and before that, the beginning of the 1900s. So we can't look at the past through our sensibilities of today. So sex was not something you had with somebody, as we understand. Sex was something you did to somebody. So in ancient Athens, the sex objects come in two varieties. So you were it was not the male and female, you were either the penetrator dominant and the aggressive, or you were the penetrated and submissive. So those were the two categories: male masculine, female feminine, dominant penetrator, submissive penetrated. So it was not male and female. It could be men taking the role of a female, right? So you were taking the male role, or you were taking the female role. You were playing the role of masculine, or you were playing the role of feminine, and men could play the role of feminine if they were penetrated. So same-sex acts were condemned in both, they were common in Greece and Rome, and about 400, 500 years, 400, 500, 4th, 5th century, they started to be condemned within the culture, but certainly at the time of when the Bible was written, they were not condemned, they were common. And it was Christians coming along and changing sexual ethics. But the sexual act, through much of history, between male and female, was to be avoided like the plague and kept to a minimum. This is a lot of the imposition of the Catholic Church. And during the medieval times, the Catholic Church had such unbelievable rules on how and when you were supposed to have sex. I mean, it's like they completely sucked the joy out of any kind of sexual experience. They came up with detailed lists of if you did certain things, the penance you had to the penance you had to practice because you had had inappropriate sex. So the church made it illegal to have sex since the medieval ages, have sex on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, 40 days before Easter and Christmas, 3 days before going to communion, 40 days after conception, and of course, when you were practicing penance, you couldn't have sex either. And they even revamped part of the creation story to say that Adam was expelled from the garden because he got the knowledge of sex, and menstruation was a curse on Eve for seducing Adam. So that's where you can blame all those cramps. It was Eve for seducing Adam. Peter Damian. Now here's going to be an interesting point. 1100, this 11th century, Peter Damian is a Catholic monk, and he's noticing, this is in the news this week, he's noticing that there are priests doing inappropriate things with little boys. He says there are acts that they're doing with little boys that the priests are coming to, they're having ejaculations, and he writes this very specific list of here's the things the priests are doing with little boys, and he says this must be wrong, and he coins the word sodomia, sodomy. And so, but it was specifically a word that was intending to say what priests were doing with little boys. And a problem that it was a priest, but within 200 years, it came a word that came into the culture, and within the culture, it meant that people were having non-procreative sex. So husbands and wives could also be guilty of having non-procreative sex. Okay? So if a husband and a wife engaged in an act that was not intent towards procreation, that was sodomy also. Okay? So sodomy was an act. A sodomy was not a person. Peter Damian was fairly obsessed about women. He thought that women should keep themselves to be virgins and enter into nunneries so that they could serve Christ. I mean, he didn't think that one through. I mean, what do you do with the rest of the human race if all the women are supposed to enter into the nunneries? One of the first English common laws against same-sex behavior was written in 1290. It was called these laws called the Fletas, F-L-E-T-A, and they actually enumerated. It was the first time same-sex behavior, same-sex sex, was criminalized, but also in that list of being criminalized, the act said those who have dealings with Jews or Jewesses, those who commit bestiality or sodomites are to be buried alive after legal proof that they were in the act. So it was just as bad to have same-sex acts as to have sex with a Jew or a Jewess or an animal. These were all lumped together. These were what they thought. St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, he said that same-sex acts needed to be procreative, just like other theologians said, and he was so protective of the human sperm because he thought all the good was in the sperm that he actually said that it was more right that incest or rape had occurred than masturbation, right? Because at least with incest and rape, you could end up getting a baby. Okay? Next, buggery is another word for sodomy, and in 1533, the English passed this law of buggery, and buggery was essentially the same things, outlining what was legal and what was not legal, and it was the first time within the English system that actually same-sex behavior and anything non-procreative that heterosexuals can think up, which are a few things, that I can think up a few, that are illegal. And it was associated with witchcraft even. So sodomy was associated with witchcraft. That remains in position for 275 years. So where are we in history? We are in about this period of history where we know what good sex and bad sex are. So good sex is procreative sex, sex where the male is dominant and penetrating, and where the sexual excesses are under control. Bad sex is the opposite, okay? So now, how do we move from that into starting to understand homosexuality? Because homosexuality is just part of that. Well, I'm not going to say the word homosexuality. Same-sex behavior is just part of what bad sex is because it's not procreative and one man is being dominated. So now we start into this place where, can I ask you, did that clock start when I started talking or when we started? Because I'm way off. Okay, just go. Okay. Progression of human sexuality for understanding. We can divide our understanding of same-sex behavior into amorphic places of where sexuality is. Before this point of time, in 1868, it was the role you played. So remember, if you played the role of a man, if you were the penetrator, it was good sex. If you were the penetrated, it was bad sex. And then we're going to come to a period of time right here where there's a gentleman named Carl Kurt-Benny, and in 1868, Carl Kurt-Benny starts noticing people around him that are not a man with a boy, but two men together that have emotional, sexual, and romantic interests with one another. And he says, now, this is a little different. So he says, it's not really about the role you're playing in sex. There seems to be several ways that people are having sex, who they're attracted to. So he defines sex by who you're attracted to. 1868 is the first time this ever happens, okay? So it's not like it had never happened before, but somebody stops and says, no, there are ways that people are having sex. So he says they're having, it's in German originally, but he says there are heterosexuals. Now, don't be deceived that that's heterosexuals as we understand. Those heterosexuals were having sex with the same sex, the opposite sex, the same sex, animals, and children, okay? But the distinction was they were having sex that was lust-filled sex. This is a problem. So this heterosexual word is associated with lust and excesses. And then there were homosexuals. They were having sex with the same sex, and it was non-procreative, so that was a problem. And then there were natural sexuals, which are like our heterosexuals. They were only having sex with the opposite sex. And then there were heterogenics that were only having sex with animals. And then there were monosexuals that were having sex with themselves. Masturbators, right? So he defines these different ways that people are having sex. He writes to a guy named Karl Urix. We got him? Karl Urix, just before this, he had been thinking about how people were having sex. And because his wife seemed to be having sex with women, he started thinking about this, and he says, okay, how can my wife possibly be having sex with the same sex, and how can I see men having sex with the same sex? So he came up with a theory that said, there's this thing called a sex love inside of people, and generally it's the sex love, it's this thing, it's for the opposite sex, and put inside of me, it makes me fall in love with a man. But if you put this thing inside, this sex love inside of a man that's supposed to be for the opposite sex, he falls in love with a man. So this kind of transferable sex love thing. So he notices that there are some men that are attracted to men. He calls them diurnings, and diurnings are the true men, but because the sex love is for the opposite sex, and he calls the men that are falling in love with the same sex earnings. So these are very basic terms, and they're just trying to figure this out. So we're only in the 1870s, but at least it's a defining point where it's not the role you played anymore, but it's who you're attracted to. So very, very slow progression. And after that, I mean, we're going to slow it down after this, so then we're going to go to a period, so it'll be who you're attracted to, so it's attractions, and then till about the 19 teens, 20s, as I said, these lines are kind of squiggly lines. Then it's going to become a mental illness. Yay, so much better than a mystery. And then it'll be a mental illness until about the 70s, and then it'll be a preference, which is the word I learned. Okay, and then eventually here it's going to become, in about the 1990s, we're going to start using the word sexual orientation. So we've had this long progression of not understanding what same-sex behavior looks like. So we've gone from all through history of it's the role you play, then it's a mystery, then it's a mental illness. Well, how did we get to that point? So Carl Urings is next. The next person that comes along, and incidentally, no one focuses on what's going on between women, because basically, who cares what women do with their bodies, right? Because they don't have a part of the procreative process, really. It doesn't matter what they do with their eggs. It just matters where a man places his semen. So, but there was sex love. Women could have these sex loves too, but no one's concentrating very much on women at all. And during this time, there are also no women doctors or psychologists, so they're not studying women and not writing the stories until about when Freud comes along 20 years later. But where women are starting to enjoy sex. The Roaring Twenties come up, women are starting to enjoy sex. There were some lesbian books being written, but at the time they would have been considered pornography. So if there was a lesbian heroine, a book, the most popular one was The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. It was written in 1928, and it was banned in the United States for 31 years. But if someone were going to write a lesbian hot novel, the lesbian at the end had to die in a house fire, or ride her horse off a cliff, or end up in a mental institution, or end up married to a man, but she couldn't end up in a lesbian relationship, right? Otherwise, it would have been pornography. But from page 1 until she rode her horse off the cliff, there was hot sex in there, and so that was good enough for some people, right? And they didn't start studying sex between women. They didn't start studying this as a separate category until, which way is she going to go? 1999. Before that, it was like, men do this, flip-sided, women do this, right? Okay, we know that's not true. We know that's so not true. So, but Lisa Diamond started doing those studies, and this is a thing that always gives me a chuckle, too. It wasn't even until 1956 with Masters and Johnson that they proved that women were having orgasms, right? I mean, they could have said, hello, what's that thing that, why are you smiling? But they didn't, because men were doing the studies. So, okay, this is enough about women. We don't need any more about women. So, interestingly, this word heterosexual had, who cares about lesbians? That's what it's just like, pfft, who cares about lesbians? What about lesbians? Not much. There's a lot going on, but women aren't writing the histories, so we're not going to care much about them. But I want to read for you the definition, the first definition of a heterosexual. So if you're heterosexual, clap your hands, be happy, and this is your definition. They are given over to excess sex with men or women and masturbation. Heterosexual, okay, I'm not misspeaking. They did it all. They are likely to assault minor boys and girls. They indulge in incest. They have sex with animals and corpses if they don't have any control. And some of them are bleeders, and they can only satisfy their lust by wounding and torturing. That's the definition of a heterosexual. So what we're supposed to see in this is the first definition of heterosexual had lust and passion attached to it, and that's problematic, remember? Sex is supposed to be self-controlled, procreative, and male-dominant, and it breaks one of the rules that it's got lust associated with it. It's going to take another 66 years for the word heterosexual to become the definition that we're now comfortable with, okay? Next guy on the history chart is Carl Westphal. Carl Westphal in 1869, he's still trying to figure out why people are attracted to the same sex. He says there's this contrary sexual feeling inside of someone. So it's contrary because if it's inside of me, I'm supposed to love a man, but if I fall in love with a woman, it's contrary. So he says, someone that reads his work says, first person translates it into Italian and calls this contrary sexual feeling inversione sexuale. And when somebody writes about it in English, they write it's sexual invert or inverted sexual proclivity. Sexual invert is a word that's going to get used through the middle of the 1950s. Someone's sexuality is inverted inside of them, okay? And inverted sexual proclivities actually make sense too for what they thought. A proclivity was an objectional behavior. So it's an inverted because the male and the female psyche, sexual feelings are inverted inside of someone. They're the wrong feelings. And it's an objectional behavior. So when we hear that word, which I heard all the time in the 60s and 70s and 80s, is sexual proclivity. It's a word we don't use so much anymore. We finally learned this. It's actually called a sexual orientation. This is the tail end. We're not, as I said, we're not paying much attention to women. This is the tail end of the Victorian era, and it was believed anyway that sexual drive was a male trait and not a female trait. So women's feelings, women's relationships were not seen as romantic or sexual. But Westphal was the first guy that came along and he said, well, same-sex attractions are perhaps a mental illness. So now he started laying that on top of women too, and especially if a woman looked like a sexual invert, she looked masculine, she had to start hiding. But before this, women that were in relationships with one another, they were not even imagined to be sexual at all. They called them crushes or spoons, and they called those women. They wouldn't have called them lesbians. They would have said that they were roommates or they were masturbators. They actually would have said that. But they couldn't imagine that women were having sexual relationships with one another. Even Freud, when he finally comes along and starts talking about why people are homosexual, he imagines that the women that are enjoying sex, that there's something, that's a mental illness too. So he says because women are supposed to be virginal and not supposed to have these sexual attractions, but yay, thank you, Anna Freud and Helena Deutsch were accomplished psychotherapists at the time, and they knocked Sigmund a little upside the head and said, you're not even studying women. Stop saying this stuff. And during this time, to show that not much was thought about women having sex with one another, Henry James wrote the Bostonians, and it was modeled after his sister and her partner living together. And that, from then on, people couldn't imagine, though, that there was anything sexual in those kind of relationships, but they called them Boston marriages. Two women living together would be in a Boston marriage. So now the word we're on is kind of sexual invert, and now we're going to see what happens if this word is going to start making it into the culture. So the first place it starts making it is the word homosexual. It's the next one, Ed. The word homosexual ends up in a medical journal these are very slow progressions. Medical journal in 1892. It ends up in a medical dictionary in 1901. And a guy named A.A. Brill in Philadelphia says it in a medical lecture in 1911. And so as I said, it's a very slow progression. It's still not into the culture. Next guy that comes along in 1893 is Krafft-Ebing, and Krafft-Ebing now comes up with the word hetero-sexual. See, we're still progressing. But what he says that heterosexuality is a sexual perversion. It's a mystery, no one's understanding it, but this is what he says. But he did see that could see that there were some people that were hetero/sexual that he could say good things about. They weren't all mentally defective. They weren't all the sexual perverts, because he could see the good in some of their lives. But when he had to come up with why people were heterosexual, what he blamed it on was it was possibly glandular, but the probable cause of homosexuality was masturbation. Okay? Masturbation in much of the Bible, self-abuse, right? You've heard that term, you've seen that term in the Bible, used in the Bible. Why, you should know now, why would self-abuse, masturbation be so problematic? Because it was non-procreative. Okay? This is the basic problem of why it's so problematic. So now we're going to have some interesting people. Masturbation has been a huge problem for much of history and has been causal to, or they thought, causal to creating so many problems, all kinds of problems. But thank you that there were some people that came along that said, thank you facetiously, there were some people that came along and said, there's lives of excess going on here, and if we can just keep people from being excessive in their eating, in their drinking, in their sexual behaviors, then we can stop them from having all of these perversions and all these illnesses going along. So he created, this guy in particular, his name is, he's a conservative Presbyterian minister, Reverend Sylvester Graham, and he thought that a bland and pure diet could start to control people's sexual excesses. You know where I'm going, don't you? So he creates a bland food for people to remind them to keep a life of self-control and no excesses. So he creates the graham cracker, okay? So enjoy your graham crackers, your s'mores by the fires, but don't do it alone, and keep both your hands on the table, okay? And he's not the only one. We have another, and why is she talking about masturbation? Because people thought that masturbation causes homosexuality. We've been off on a few tangents here. I mean, the planet should be filled with 98% of homosexuals in that case, right? So then there was another person, another anti-masturbator of the day. His name was John Harvey Kellogg. So what did he create? Granola and cornflakes. Bland diets to keep you from expressing your excesses, to keep you from masturbating. So again, enjoy your cornflakes in the morning, but keep both your hands on the table. We don't want you expressing your excesses. So he was so sex negative that he never even consummated his own marriage, and they adopted all their children. But isn't that interesting? So people thought, these guys and lots of people thought, that masturbation inflamed the brain and caused all kinds of problems: epilepsy, blindness, early death, and homosexuality. So there was this point of time in the US history, and you can look at, if you're like me, you spend hours looking at this stuff. What are the circumcision rates in the United States, and how did they change? Because they believed that if you would circumcise a baby boy, that would cause sexual diseases to not spread when they were older, never proven. And also, if you cut off their foreskin, they wouldn't masturbate. And if you didn't cut off the foreskin, at least do the right thing for your baby boy and cover his penis with leather or plaster of Paris. You know, you don't want your children masturbating, because then their brains will swell, they'll be epileptic, or worse yet, homosexuals, okay? So if you're looking for a cause as to your sexual orientation, there you go. Von Krafft-Ebing, though, he said sex was primarily for procreation, and he said that any sexual act that didn't involve procreation was a perversion. So, which was unlike both Urix and Kurt Benny. They just said, there's this thing, we don't understand where it is. Now we've progressed a little further and says, there's this thing, and it's a sexual perversion, it's a mental illness. So that's what's going on in the medical stuff, in the medical field. In the culture was starting to kind of divide what love looked like too. And the upper classes practiced true love, and their love was a devout, true love. But the lower classes, like the immigrants, so we're talking about the Italians, they're a big one, the Italians, the Irish, the Jews, the blacks, what they experienced was lust, and it was not true love like we experienced. So they're starting to divide what love and lust looks like too. But the story is consistent. True love is good, lust and sensuality are bad, procreation is good, non-procreation is bad. Very similar streams that are still going. Heterosexuality is still not equated with normal sex. It's going to take a little bit of time for that to happen. So in the 1930s, where we are, 1920s and 30s, so if you were in the 1920s and 30s, imagine yourself back there, and if you have had non-procreative sex with your partner, spouse, interest, in the last little while, and it was your sex with them non-procreative, and you enjoyed it, and it was not male-dominant, penis to vagina, in the 1930s, you would have been a sexual pervert. That was the definition, okay? So I want to say something here, right here, about sex. generally socially constructed what's acceptable and not acceptable. If you read enough history, if you read across cultures, if you read across times, I just, for my book club, finished reading a book that was Chinese culture, and there were some sexual practices before marriage that Christians don't adhere to, right? But this is their culture. So get outside yourself. There are other ways to do sex and what's appropriate in other cultures. I just want to say that just as an aside. So what's acceptable now for heterosexuals wasn't acceptable in the 1930s. So now homosexuals aren't acceptable in spots, but what you are, if you're heterosexual, was not acceptable 60 or 70 years ago. What was normal in ancient Greece and ancient Rome was different. A lot of same-sex behavior going on. In ancient Greece, they would have seen it as the Romans saw same-sex behavior as domination. The Greeks saw same-sex behavior somewhat beneficial. So a mother would sometimes pick a man to mentor her son because so much of his intellect and his power and his social gravitas would pass through the semen. So she would want that for her son, okay? So now let's see what's happening in the culture. So in the culture, cities are growing, people are getting into same-sex environments for the first time. There was a 10-year drought in the Midwest. Half the population of the United States came into the cities. People are being exposed to same-sex populations for the first time ever. So a guy out on the farm that didn't understand quite well he was not attracted to Betty Lou down the road, all of a sudden sees like Matthew at the YMCA, yes, the YMCA, and says like, you know, he's flipping my switch. And so starts to investigate those things. And a lot of people could have gone on to get married, but also women are coming into the work environment, women are becoming educated. During the Civil War, when men were off to war, colleges still had to fill those seats. They allowed women to go to school. So before the 1860s, there were only 5 colleges or universities that allowed women in, and during the 1860s, women started to get educated. So we see even this shift in the culture where most of the men were teachers, now the women are teachers. So at the turn of the century, within the culture, there is this pressure because we're seeing women in men's environments. And this gender blurring lines are happening. And Teddy Roosevelt is the president then, and Teddy Roosevelt was probably our most macho president we ever had. He, took all his own band up San Juan Hill. He got all the ranchers together. He boxed. He went on safaris. We have a very testosterone-driven society at the beginning of the 1900s because Teddy Roosevelt put out this imperative to be a manly man, really called it that, so that men should start expressing their manliness. And actually, that's why the Boy Scouts of America came into the United States in 1912, because too many of our boys were being educated sissified by their female teachers, so they brought the Boy Scouts of America, Lord Baden-Powell, his program into America, and oh, what a shocker. About 4 years ago, the latest biography of Lord Baden-Powell came out, and he was probably a closeted homosexual, right? He had a relationship with a friend through much of his life, and when the friend went on to get married, it was a huge disappointment to Lord Baden-Powell. And when you understand a few years ago why the Boy Scouts, they didn't want homosexuals in their ranks, well, they were founded by a closeted homosexual. Okay? Prohibition. Prohibition comes to the United States. It doesn't mean, so it's illegal to, all these things are connected. It's illegal to make, transport, or sell alcohol. It doesn't mean that there's no bars. During the height of Prohibition in New York City alone, there were 25,000 speakeasies. And the social scene was ripe with people who were called homosexual, sexual inverts. They were even called fairies. There were some words. Men were calling themselves queer. It was a word that they owned at first. They were calling themselves queer, and they were very much in the social scenes. And when the 21st Amendment came along and abolished prohibition, there were rules set on bars, and the rules said if there's any of these inappropriate kinds of people that come into your establishment, you're going to lose your business license. And they picked 2 kinds of people that were inappropriate to be in business establishments, and they were female prostitutes and male homosexuals. You're going to see wanton women and male homosexuals hooked through history. You're going to just see them hooked up through history. And we can see that even in language. So the word gay comes from a French word gai, and in the 17th century it was associated with female prostitutes that fornicated. The word faggot, F-A-G-O-T, not two G's, was associated with like a shrewish woman in the 1800s of England, and she'd be a bent-over wench that nobody wanted, and she would go throughout the streets and she would collect bundles of sticks, faggots, French word, with one G still, and she would use that to cook her food and keep herself warm. So she was a tossed-off woman. She was called a faggot. So that word was associated with a man that was penetrated, that was a tossed-off man. So you can see through history, the words that were associated first with women became debasing words for men. Molly, pansy, buttercup, all of these women. So again, I guess we're still, every once in a while you get a what about women, what about lesbians? So what about lesbians? So the word that was being used for lesbians at the time was lesbians and sapphos, F-A-S-A. S-A from the Greek lyricist poet, Sapphos, S-A-P-P-O-H-O-S. But lesbians is easy, the truth is, lesbians is easier to speak and say than sapphos. That's it. So lesbians, the word that got stuck. Also a word that was used was bulldyker. So it was D-Y-K-E, and the word dyke is a really derogatory slang word for a woman's vulva in Dutch. So then it got shortened. This was a word that was used in Harlem, bulldykes, women that liked women, and then all of a sudden it got shortened to dyke, and that's where dykes come. It's a derogatory word for your lady parts. So there you go. Okay, the next piece is now how are we going to start shifting? How does this start shifting to trying to understand what human sexuality is? It's the beginning of psychoanalysis and understanding what homosexuality is. Next person we have on our list, our hit parade of thinkers, is Havelock Ellis. Now, Havelock Ellis is going to become an important word, an important person when we look at the RSV, surprisingly. And he is one of the first people that begins to unhinge sex from procreation, okay? He's one of the first, because remember, good sex has been procreative. And he's one of the first that says, well, not all sex has to end up in procreation, but still, homosexuality is a deviance because it's never procreative and it needs to be fixed. So he too says the way that homosexuality comes about is masturbation. He's another one. He agrees that it comes about with masturbation. It causes all kinds of things, but masturbation causes homosexuality. So he doesn't, other people, Krafft Ebing, well, Havelock Ellis did not think that sexual deviances were a mental illness or a pathology. Krafft Ebing did, but he is at least a person that says it's not totally a sickness, but it can be cured. Okay? So his name is going to come up later in history, but what you need to know about him is he's one of the first that says sex doesn't have to be for procreation. Next, we have, there are other people that are trying to fix sexual deviances too. The Women's Temperance Union comes along, and at least they do a very good thing. They raise, in the turn of the century, they raise the age of consent for children from 10 and 12 to 16. Thank you. Yep. Also, within the culture, people are trying to figure out why there are people abusing children. There are sex offenders. So what are we going to do with sex offenders? Sex offenders and sexual perverts and sex fiends, all of these kinds of people, how are we going to deal with them? At the time, eugenics was coming into fruition in the 19-teens and 20s. How do we get rid of people that are sex perverts and epileptics and feeble-minded and the idiots, morons, and imbeciles? These are their words. I mean, they probably could apply to several people you know, but they really did have they had a scientific definition. If you operated at up to the age of 3 years old, 5 years old, 8-year-old, you were an idiot, imbecile, or moron. And how do we get rid of these people and the chronically poor and the sexual perverts, which were homosexuals? Well, you castrate them. You help them not to have children anymore. There were just ways that people were dealing with anyone outside the norm. Homosexuality started to be defined by Freud. He's the next one. Freud comes along and he says, everybody goes through these psychosexual stages from their infancy. And they start out as children, they hit the mid-years, and they come to adults. And he postulates that homosexuals don't go through the entire psychosexual development, and they get stuck in childhood. So they get attracted to the same sex, and they get stuck there. But he says, don't worry, I can use psychoanalysis, and I can fix them. So he's the first guy that comes along and says, I can fix homosexuals. He also completely unhinges sex from procreation, very important piece. Because if he unhinges sex from procreation, all of a sudden the heterosexuals that are having non-procreative sex and they're enjoying themselves, they're going to get normalized. Okay? So he also says enjoying sex is normal. He calls it libido. So he starts to normalize heterosexuality, and that's what he successfully does. He says sexual passion is good, sex isn't just for procreation, and he can fix gay people. So he is the guy that starts talking about these principles, and by the 1920s and 30s, he starts normalizing heterosexuality. So heterosexuality, which used to be a horrible thing to be because it was excessive and could be non-procreative, he normalizes that and he says heterosexual is now a good thing, homosexual is a bad thing. And I told you the women didn't escape his judgment. He thought women enjoying sex was completely inappropriate. What's the next slide, Ed? Is it about the dictionaries again? So in the next progression we see, this is shocking stuff. Homosexuality ends up in a dictionary in 1909. Heterosexuality ends up in a dictionary in 1923. Heterosexuality in 1934, right? Yeah, 1934 is defined as normal sexuality for the first time. So it's now unhinged from procreation, and it's allowed to be passionate. And for the first time ever, heterosexuals are considered normal. Okay? But by the end of Freud's life, he thought that homosexuals need to be fixed. But by the end of Freud's life, he said, in a very famous letter called The Letter to an American Mother in 1935, he says, no, it's part of normal human sexuality and it can't be fixed. So he goes back on what he originally said. So now it's normal, heterosexuality is considered the normal thing. Okay. So what's happening, and this is going to come up later with Bibles. So in Germany, let's just shift a little bit of time and geography. Germans are the ones that are studying human sexuality. And in the 19-teens, I think in 1911, they opened something called the Sex Institute in Berlin. And over the next 20 years, they collected 10,000 stories and 30,000 records of non-heteronormative people. So people that we would call today possibly homosexuals, transgender people, they would have said transgender, transsexual people, non-heteronormative people. They collected all these journals. Germany was the place they were happening. It was mostly Jewish scientists doing it. Hitler comes in. Hitler reads some eugenic stuff while he's in prison, writing Mein Kampf. The eugenic stuff is written by an American, by the way, translated into German. He reads these things and he starts thinking about the kinds of people he doesn't want in the German race, in the Aryan nation. So in 1933, one morning in 1933, there's an article in the paper that basically says that these Jewish swines that are studying sexuality have to be put under control. So the students invade this sex institute, which had collected 30,000 records of people, science, and they storm the place. They throw all the stuff out the window. They throw ink on the documents that aren't in there, that are there. They just destroy the place. They throw everything out the window, and finally the stormtroopers come and they set everything afire. So by then they've got tens and tens of thousands of records that are destroyed. And this becomes important because that is part of science and scientific records that were completely destroyed. And it's going to become important because we're going to see we want to know what Germany does to their Bible translations eventually. So that's going on in Germany. They're getting rid of all of their records. Why did they want to get rid of homosexuals? They persecuted homosexuals in this. Very easy, because homosexuals were sexual deviants, and that deviance could be passed on to other people through procreation. Like a gay person makes gay people, so we've got to get rid of them. So that's why homosexuals were put in the concentration camps too, and also they were wasting their procreative potential by having homosexual sex. So Hitler changes the schools of psychiatry, drives all the scientists out of Germany. Most of them end up in either England or the United States. And they come into England and the United States. Most of them are German Jews. They come into the United States in the 30s while they're being persecuted, and they walk into America where there's two things we definitely don't like. We don't like Germans, and we don't like Jews. They come into the United States. They don't come in with their progressive sexual ideas. They try to put themselves into the Victorian, isolationist mind frame, and all of those psychoanalysts, et cetera, that start coming to the United States start creating theories about why people are homosexual. With absolutely no science behind them, they start creating theories. Well, maybe it's the smothering mother that makes them homosexual. Maybe it's glandular problems. What causes it? Did they get stuck in these childish stages? According to Freud, did they get stuck in the oral period? Well, maybe one of the guys burglar says, I know what it is. They were weaned too soon. So you got to use your your imagination on this. So they were weaned too soon. So they were used to sucking on their mother's breast to get this white milk out of it, okay? So when they were weaned too soon, so they had to revert back to something. They had to suck on something to get the white stuff out of it, right? That was actually a theory, yep. There was another guy, the same guy, burglar. He's going to come up in history again, too. He writes books. He's had, in his practice of 30 years, he's observed in his office 11 different people. And this is what he says about homosexuals. They are swindlers. He's studying. He's a researcher. Swindlers, pathological liars, forgers, drug purveyors, gamblers, pimps, spies, and brothel owners, right? So how do we cure these homosexuals? So now we're in this period of the 30s and 40s. How do we cure homosexuals? Well, a good lobotomy goes a long way. So there was a state mental institution in Atascadero, California, and in the early years of the 40s, they did about 4,000 lobotomies. So you stick an ice pick through the eye and an eye orbital, and you scramble the brain around a little bit, and that'll make someone stop being homosexual. And 40% of the people they did it on were men that were put in this mental institution for consensual, private, same-sex acts. Okay? You could also inject, the way you could cure homosexuals was inject them with female hormones. So if you've seen the Imitation Game, they injected Alan Turing with estrogen, and he said all it made him do was get bigger breasts and run slow. I understand. So mothers were also blamed very much for this, but mothers were blamed for having lesbian daughters too. They gave them too much or not enough affection. I mean, it's either one or the other. So that they didn't mature, and that triggered their need, so they wanted a woman. Moms were basically to blame for everything. Um, where do I want to go? There's this progression of women. So women in the past have been the wanton, sexual, the temptresses. In about the 1700s, this concept of female chastity comes in. And then in the 1800s, love changes radically. I mean, marriage changes radically. People say that same-sex marriage changed the definition of marriage. No. Women changed the definition of marriage in the mid-1800s by associating love with marriage. Some people were so afraid that when you started associating love with marriage, then men would have to show their love for women, and women would have to be satisfied within a marriage or the divorce rates would go up. And they thought this was a great social experiment to introduce love into marriage. And the definition of marriage started changing. And so when love and marriage came together, we're going to start to see the women's movement progress. The very short part of this is the women's movement progress. Women start wanting more rights. 1920s, women start going out and enjoying sex a little bit more, and then they start wanting procreative control of their own procreative abilities by going after birth controls. Really interesting. During the 1850s, it would have been called abortifacients. Abortifacients were available through the mail. They were even advertised in Christian magazines for women how they could perform abortions. But that started changing when the Protestants were very aware that they were their women having abortions. In 1871, 20% of the pregnancies in America were ended by abortion from abortifacients that were sold in the mail. And Protestants started getting very concerned that the ones that weren't having these abortions or creating abortion were Catholics. So we don't want too many Catholic babies as opposed to ours. So women start moving towards unhinging sex and procreation too. So there's these movements in the psychological world, there's these movements of changing the definition and what women want in marriage, and they want more control, and the culture is just shifting towards unhinging sex from procreation, introducing sexual pleasure and love into the equation. These are huge steps. Interestingly, just as a side note, contraception didn't become legal in the Supreme Court for women until 1965, married women. And it was 1972 that single women could get access to procreative materials. But this is also, we're still watching this slow progression of sex being unhinged from procreation. These are just big steps, big steps. What's happening in the military? We're going to do two more things before we get to the Bible. Almost there. Yay. Okay. So we know what's happening in the culture. There's a slow shift to unhinge sexuality from the sex act from procreation. Doctors are telling us there's something wrong with homosexuals. Nothing's happening in the Bible, by the way. We're not looking at the Bible there. What's happening in the military? And why I asked the question about what's happening in the military is because in the 1940s, 20% of the jobs in the United States were associated with the US military and State Department. So how does the military start dealing with people that we're starting to see now are mentally ill? Okay. There's a guy that comes along, his name is Henry Stack Sullivan. And he says, he comes to the department, the head of the selective service, and he says, now in World War I, we had a lot of people that ended up broken by going to war. Wouldn't it be good if we ever got into war again? He does this in 1939 and 40. Wouldn't it be great if we ever got into a situation with war again, if we were to define beforehand who those breakable people were? That would save the US government lots of money if we wouldn't break people and have them end up in military hospitals. They said it's a great idea. So he comes up with a list of 8 kinds of people that will break if you send them to war. And homosexuality is not on the list. It's 1940. He's a psychotherapist, he's a psychiatrist, he's got some Freudian theories moving around in him, But he has the experience of also working in state mental institutions and with normal people. Freud had the wealthy people that were on the couch. Henry Stack Sullivan had a lot more practical experience. So he gives this list of 8 kinds of breakable people to the government. Homosexuals are not on the list, right? The guy that he hands it to is this guy named Andrew Dykstra, who's the head of the Selective Service at the time. And he looks at the list, he starts working on it, he says, great, we won't send these kind of people off to war. Well, within 11 months, Andrew Dykstra gets replaced by another guy, Brigadier General Louis Hershey. Louis Hershey has no time for psychotherapy, psychiatrists. He doesn't believe in this new science. He doesn't believe in anything of this. He doesn't ask anybody for any medical expert opinions on homosexuality. He adds homosexual onto that list. He just adds it onto that list. So I got curious, what kind of guy would do this? What kind of guy would just add this onto the list? I mean, we all know really authoritarian type people. Well, it ends up, I just did some research on him. And he's the guy that in 1967, because he was still running the Selective Service, he's the guy that in 1967, when the Vietnam War was going on and students were protesting on campuses, he passed this memorandum, I think it was memorandum number 185. He passed a memorandum that said students had educational deferments. He said, but if they didn't have their card on them, or they burned it, or they mutilated it, they would go right up the draft line to the #1 position. He just didn't want to have anything to do with that. What was interesting about that was protests on college campuses increased radically after he did that. And the case made it to the Supreme Court, and they wiped it out. So it showed that, historically, that he was a very authoritarian man that didn't listen to input. And he is the guy that put homosexuals will break in war on the list with absolutely no evidence. So homosexuals start getting persecuted in the government, in the military, and as soon as, when the war ended, there were some legislators that kind of picked up the ball and ran with it, and we're going to see McCarthy come into that introduction. So now we're seeing homosexuals come and now be problematic. So now homosexuals are kind of moving from, they're not only mentally ill, but by 1950, they're going to also be criminals. So what a progression, right? We don't understand what it is, then it's a mental illness, then it's a mental illness and a crime. So we're just moving through this. But heterosexuals are normal. Heterosexuals are totally normal. So non-procreative, lust-filled sex for heterosexuals is quite normal. Where are we now? Oh, and interestingly, I guess I should mention this. So there was a biography, a 1982 biography of this guy that introduced the list to the US military, to the Selective Service. He was probably homosexual himself. He had a 20-year relationship with a young man named Jimmy. So in the 1982 biography, which I also read, so he really knew who homosexuals were. He was coming at it from an informed position. But the military, with absolutely no evidence, put homosexuals on that list of people that could not serve. No evidence at all. No evidence as to their problematic position as soldiers. Okay, where are we? So we are going to take a break here, but where are we in this? So now, the reason I wanted to get us to this point of history, because I wanted to sit right here. I want us to sit right here in this point in history. And why this is important is, so, homosexuals are mentally ill and probably criminal. They are pedophiles, and the reason that they're pedophiles is because they got stuck in this childhood stage. So the only people that they can be attracted to are other children, right? Because they're in a child stage, they haven't progressed to full maturity yet. These are the theories. And so mentally ill, sexual deviants, sexual fiends, predators, go after your kids, starting to hide after Prohibition, where they had been so popular in the speakeasies here. Now the laws have changed and said, female prostitutes and homosexuals no more. They can't go into the bars anymore, so they start going underground into their own places. And so that's exactly where we're sitting, okay? That's where we are in history. And why I'm going to leave it there and why we had to get to this point is right here, 1946, the Revised Standard Version of the Bible is going to come out. Actually, down here is the Bible line. Revised Standard Version. So we have to know, when we go in to look at those verses, what the members of the translation team understood or didn't understand about human sexuality. They were a product of their environment, right? And we have to know how they would have looked at those verses and how this entire culture would have informed them about what these verses mean. So that's where we're going to pick it up. We're going to pick up with an incredibly interesting story about the RSV, I promise you. So 10-minute break. So again, where are we in history? Homosexuality, we don't understand it. It's a mental illness, and part of the problem with it is we think it's a sexual perversion. We don't know what causes it, but almost equally as important, heterosexuality now is normalized. So sex is unhinged from procreation. Sex can be lust-filled, and it can be non-procreative, but only if you're a heterosexual. So the Bible translation. So we're next going to shift to this. So we're going to look at two Greek words. Are we, Ed? We're going to look at two Greek words. Arsenokoitai. Well, I guess we can do that. Okay, so there are clobber passages in the Bible, and there are 5, sometimes 6. And one of the clobber passages is considered this 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. And I don't know where that slide is, but I particularly want to go now to, yeah, there. That's where I want to be. Okay. So sex, we're going to talk about ancient times because this verse was written in the 1st century. So we're going to look at two particular words and what they mean in the 1st century. We're going to look at this word malakoi and arsenokoitai. And why they're important is because these two words are going to be combined up together in the 1946 version of the Revised Standard Version. The New Testament came out in 1946, September 30th, 1952, the entire Bible comes out. But in 1946 is the first time in any language, in any translation, the word homosexual ends up in the Bible, right? So it's only been recently defined, but it ends up in the Bible. So, and then the first time homosexual is going to end up in Romans 1, which is another one of the clobber verses, is in 1971. These are very new additions to the Bible. I just want to say a little bit more about sex before we go on to this. Remember that the sex of a person was not what was between their legs. Sex is rather a place that you sit on this hierarchical scale. Are you the male? Are you playing the male, masculine role or the female, feminine role? We know what good sex is and bad sex is. Penetration is how a man proves that it's virile. Somebody loses power, somebody gains power. It's a zero-sum game. A man that was penetrated lost so much power that he could no longer testify in court because he was seen to be like a woman. And the word testify comes as the same root word as testicles. And to testify in court, a man would have to take his left hand and put it on his testicles and testify, right? So if you had been penetrated or taken the role of a woman, you couldn't testify anymore because you lost your testicles. And needless to say, a woman couldn't testify because she didn't have any testicles, right? So it was all about the role you took during sex. Were you a male or a female? Were you a man? So malakos, I don't want to go there. I want to go somewhere else. Okay, we're going to, do Ed go back to that clobber verses? Because I should have. So there are these places in the Bible. Genesis 1, which is the Sodom and Gomorrah story, which we're not going to deal with, which is about rape of a stranger. Leviticus, we're going to deal with that tomorrow night when we look at the Living Bible, because that's the first place the word homosexuality is going to end up in the Bible. In Leviticus is going to be 1971. Romans 1:26 and 27, it's kind of speculative. It ends up in a commentation on the Bible in 1953. 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 10, homosexual is going to end up in 1946, 1952. And 1 Timothy 1:10 is going to end up in the Bible in the 70s as well. So these are very new places where homosexuality ends up in the Bible. So now Corinthians, okay? So these are the people that are not going to heaven. Malakoi people and arsenokoitai people. So who are these people? Let's look at the word malakoi first because it's a little bit easier. So malakoi indicates mostly a weakness of character. And it's associated with a softness, and it's not just a word about sex, it's associated with the qualities of being a woman. Because the last thing you want to be is to be like a woman. So it has all those awful qualities of a woman. So if you were called malakoi, you were lazy, the qualities of a woman. We all know these. Lazy, decadent, lack of courage, can't put up with hard work, a coward, drinks too much, unchaste, lustful, has too much sex. And about men, the ones that love gourmet food, they study too much, they read too many books, they preen themselves like peacocks to attract women and seduce other men's wives, and a penetrated man was malakos. So this is what the word malakoi or malakos means. And in ancient times, these would have been seen as feminine traits. So a man that had feminine traits or was penetrated like a woman was called malakos. But being penetrated wasn't the only way you could be malakos. You could be malakos by being all these other things. Decadent, liking too much gourmet food. So put yourself in the list. If there's anything on the top of the list you are, then you would have been called malakos, which is eventually going to get translated to homosexual, which is pretty funny. Well, it's very unfortunate, actually. So, and the word arsenokoitai, let's go there. That's the next word. Arsenokoitai is the second part of this, and arsenokoitai is a very hard word to know what it means. For 600 years of history, it appears only 100 times in surrounding literature of the time, of 600 years. It's believed that Paul took this word and coined it. Yes, arsenokoitai is in Leviticus, in male bed, but that was 1,400 years before. I don't know very many words that have held their same meaning for 1,400 years, and that's just not a good way to look at this. We have to try to figure out what this word means. So we can go and we can look into text to see what it means, but the problem is it only appears in lists. So it appears particularly, the two lists that people tend to look at are the Acts of John, the Acts of John and the Sibylline oracles from the 6th century and the 2nd century. So we see this word in the lists. In the Acts of John, it's a condemnation of the rich men of Ephesus, and it's a list of their economic sins, their abusive economic sins towards others. And we see this word on the list of these economic abusive sins. And there's an economic list of exploitation, economic exploitation, and there's a sin list. Arsenokoitai is not on the sin list. It's on the economic exploitation list. So that should give us some kind of indication what this word means, but we still don't know. In the Sibylline oracles, there's another two lists. There's the economic list and the sexual sin list again. Arsenokoitai appears on the economic list, and here's where it appears. It says, don't accept blood money, don't steal, don't arsenokoitai, don't do it. Don't cheat an employee for their wages, don't oppress the poor, and don't neglect providing for orphans and widows. It's not on the sin list once again. So if it were a sexual sin, we could expect it to be on the sin list, and it's not. So whatever they were doing in Corinth that Paul felt the need to use and coin this word, it was something that had to do with some kind of exploitation of others, abuse of others, and yes, in this case, there was a sexual exploitative abuse of others. I really like Professor Dale Martin, a retired professor from Yale's explanation of arsenokoitai here. He says, So what is happening in Corinth? He doesn't like what's happening in Corinth, and it's polluting the church. And he says, how he imagines it is that there's younger men that are allowing themselves to be sexually used to climb the social ladder. And there's older men that are sexually using younger men for their own excesses and purposes. But the emphasis on it is this exploitative use of others in both directions, And we can kind of see these kind of relationships today, and they're not just homosexual. I mean, I can imagine that there are heterosexual relationships where an older person is using a younger person for their own sexual purposes, and the younger person is trying to take advantage of the older person's social status. So arsenokoitai goes on today, but it's not just same-sex behavior. So a good definition of arsenokoitai might be, and because nobody knows what arsenokoitai means, because as I said, it's only on lists, men who sexually exploit males to gain social power. It has to have that component of exploitation within it. And it's absolutely not addressing what women do sexually. Got nothing to do with women. So when it translates to homosexual, which also includes women, the original word has nothing, arsenokoitai has nothing to do with women, and malakoi has nothing to do with women. It has to do with men behaving with having these traits of women, but it doesn't have to do with what women are doing. So it's really interesting that Peter Cantor in the 1100s, he was a French theologian, and he was asked to go through the Bible and to find all the verses in the Bible that had anything to do with same-sex behavior. And he listed Genesis 19, the Sodom and Gomorrah story, Leviticus 18, who to have sex with and not to have sex with, or you're going to die, and 20, Romans 1, excessive sexual practices in Romans 1, and Jude, sex with angels, right? Nowhere in that list did he list 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and he did not list 1 Timothy. And those are kind of our go-to verses today. So how did that verse get in there? But first we're going to look at how it was translated before 1946. So, Vanna, how was it translated before 1946? So in the Wycliffe Bible, it says, those that commit lechery with their own kind, and they do lechery with men. In the Tyndale Bible in the 1500s, it says, weaklings, the malakoi word, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, sperm placed inappropriately in not procreative spaces. So all kinds of non-procreative sex. In the German Bible, this is going to be so interesting at the end of tomorrow. Weichling and Knabenschänders, so weaklings, those that act like women because women are the weaklings, and Knabenschänder is a boy abuser, boy molesters. That's how the Germans translated the word in 1534. So just imagine tomorrow that we're going to follow how the Germans translated that word, knowing that the Germans were the first people that coined the word, and the Germans were the ones that were the theologians and wrote lots of versions of the Bible during the 20s, 30s, 40s, when homosexuality was an issue. How did they translate the Bible as ongoing? King James Bible said, nor the effeminate. The effeminate didn't mean limp-wristed effeminate. Effeminate meant to have the qualities of a woman. So those that have those awful qualities of a woman, or abusers of themselves with mankind. Non-procreative sex, okay? Do I have a next one? Okay. 1901, the American Standard Version, nor the effeminate, nor the abusers of themselves with mankind. This is an interesting one. The Moffat Bible, nor the catamite, nor the sodomite. So catamite is a word that James Moffat, and he's an interesting character. James Moffat wrote this Bible as a Scottish theologian, and he ended up on the translation team for the 1946 version of the Bible. And his translation, so the catamite would be the person that's penetrated, and the sodomite, the one that's doing the penetration. And tomorrow we're going to look at where that word catamite actually comes from. But In 1913, he said it was catamite or sodomite. 1946, the two words are combined, remember? One means to have those awful qualities of woman, and the other one means to have some kind of excessive economic abuse, sexual abuse of another person. And the team combines those two words and makes the translation homosexual. Okay? So all of a sudden, this act of sodomy is no longer an act, it is a kind of person for the first time in history. It becomes a kind of person. How the heck did that happen? Okay? So when I would teach this, I would get to this point of the timeline, and I would do as I have to you and say, so this is what we know about homosexuality, and then I'd say, the translation team for this translation, they were born from 1870. First people were born here, and the last person was born 1917. So when they were, coming up in their years, this was the understanding that they had of homosexuality, right? So when they were 50, 60, 70-year-old white men doing the Bible translations, this is what they would have understood. But they were born into this culture where we didn't even know what homosexuality was. They had no idea what homosexuality was. So I would come to here and say, I believe that the work they did in translating arsenokoitai and malakoi into homosexual was ideological and cultural, and that it was not theological. Because I haven't said anything about what the Bible is doing with these words at all. Nothing. So that's what I would say. And I would say this over and over and over again. And my buddy came to my workshops a few times and called me up, and so I knew the translation team was these guys. I knew they were headed up by a guy named Dr. Luther Weigle, who had been the Dean of Yale Divinity that organized this work. It was organized by Thomas Nelson, but led the team, Thomas Nelson Publishers. And he said to me, he called me and he said, so, would you like to prove your theory? Well, of course I want to prove my theory, but I don't know how. So he said, all of Dr. Weigle's papers from his life are sitting in the Yale University archives. So he said, do you want to take a road trip? Yes. So let me tell you something about Dr. Weigle. He was ordained as a Lutheran minister in 1903. He enrolled in graduate school at Yale, this is important, where he studied philosophy, and he was a research assistant in experimental psychology. Okay? So he had some understanding of psychology. And this will become really interesting later on. By 1950, which is also a pivotal year in pastoral psychology, 80% of seminaries had some kind of class in pastoral counseling psychology. But they were operating under, it's a mental illness paradigm, right? So, but I found it really interesting that I hadn't known before that Weigle had some knowledge of psychology. He built a solid reputation as an author of a really important and well-used Sunday school book, especially in China. He ended up on the Yale staff in 1916, and in 1928 he became the Dean of Yale Divinity. He held that position until 1949. When he was 72 years old, the RSV was completed, 1952. He stayed as head of the chairman of the Standard Bible Committee until 86, and he served as the chair until he was 90. He died at 96. So this work started in 1929. It was commissioned, the copyright had run out on the American Standard Version 1901 Bible, and Thomas Nelson Publishers wanted to renew the Bible, but they wanted to put it in modern English, because the most popular Bible at the time was the King James. So the team used the American Standard Version, the English Standard Version, the King James Version primarily, plus Greek and Hebrew, and they got together and they were going to come up with a new readable Bible. So on this team, over this period of time, 15 years, where the translations took place, It started in 1929, and it went dormant for a few years during the Depression. There was no money to do the work. The team was never paid for the work. The team was paid for their travel to wherever the translation committee met and their food on the way there. So in these archives, I found even a note that was one of the guys on the team saying, like, unless you pay me my $9.29 from the trip to New Haven and my lunch at Grand Central Station, I'm not coming to the next meeting. You know, you need to pay up. It's pretty funny. But on this team, there were 9 Congregationalists, 5 Methodists, 4 Episcopalians, 3 American Baptists, 3 Southern Baptists, 2 Presbyterians, 2 United Church of God people, 1 Disciple of Christ, 1 Quaker, 1 Lutheran. Pretty diversified. What they prided themselves on is that they were excellent Hebrew and Greek scholars. So they were trying to do an accurate job as linguistic experts and not be guided by some kind of denominational theology, which we're going to find starts happening with the NIV in the 70s and 80s. So they met 31 times over 145 days, and in between that, they did a lot of mail back and forth of mimeographed copies of changes. So on each team for each book, there were 2 people that were in charge. They would do what they thought was appropriate. The mimeographed copies would be retyped and sent to the members of the committee, New Testament, and then the Old Testament people would also approve of those changes. It took a 2/3 vote to accomplish any kind of change. So we went to New Haven, and we started in the paper archives. And there were 90 pages, there were 90 boxes of papers, 90 archival office boxes. So we sat in the archives of Yale. We planned this months in advance. We got our library cards. We went in, and you can't bring papers in with you. You can bring a phone or a computer to record things. We wisely brought a friend along as a documentarian who would take pictures of documents when we didn't have time to. We knew we had a lot to go through, so we brought a documentarian with us. And we also wanted him to film in case we found anything. We didn't know what we'd find. I went in, I can personally tell you what I went in thinking. I should have known better, but I went in thinking that in 1946 there was malice attached to this translation. And that the team probably sat around and said, this word, it has to do with those filthy sexual inverts, those filthy homosexuals. Let's make this word homosexual. I was absolutely sure there would be some malice within the translation. Morning of day 3, we still hadn't found anything. But what we did find was that nobody had ever gone through all of these paper documents. We could tell because the paper clips were rusted onto pages. We could tell because paper sat on top of other paper and discolored it, and when we moved it, we could tell nobody had ever moved it. So some of these papers had been in these boxes for 60 to 80 years, and nobody had ever touched them. And we went through every last stinking piece of paper. And then when we were done with that, we couldn't find anything. What I did find that was really interesting, though, is I probably found, about maybe 50 iterations of a list. And on this list it said, here's the word in Greek or Hebrew, here's what it said in the American Standard Version, here's what it said in the English Standard Version, here's what it said in the King James, and here's what we're going to make it say in the Revised Standard Version. And there were these lists of words that were going to change. And all kinds of words changed, and absolutely nowhere on those 50 iterations of lists that I find did the word homosexual end up anywhere, which surprised me, because it was a distinct change from the American Standard Version, the English Standard Version, and the King James. It was a distinct change, and I couldn't find it on any list, and that bothered me, surprised me. So we kept going, and in the 3rd day, the paper library archives are open till 4:45, and then the microfilm archives are open till 10. We had very long days. My eyes were very tired. And on the 3rd day, we went down to the microfilms. And there were 22 rolls of microfilm with an average of 1,500 sheets of paper on each microfilm roll. So we ended up looking at about 60,000 sheets of paper. And in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, Ed and I were on separate machines. And I've got really fast eyes. I can see stuff as it floats by me quickly. So don't try anything, because I've got fast eyes. And so I could see as a page went, microfilms. You know, we used them in high school and college, right? Oh, gosh. When I called for these set of microfilms again, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. So in April, I asked for an interlibrary loan from Yale University to go through the 22 rolls of microfilm again, because it's so much fun. And they lent me the entire collection, the 22 rolls, and sent them to the University of Nevada, Reno for me for 3 months. So I was able to slow it down to make sure we didn't miss anything. And as I was sitting there going through the microfilms, there were these 2 little nerdy boys next to me, university students, and they're trying to thread the microfilms and not understand. I'm like, can I help you, little boys? Like, there was something before the internet that we actually used to use, and it was microfilm. Oh, would you, lady? Yeah, I would. So I went through these microfilms twice, but I could see the word as it floated by me, homosexual, okay? Ed, I think I found it. And I read the first 2 sentences, and I stopped, because I wanted my sweet boy next to me. So he moved on over, and our documentarian took out 2 iPhones and started recording. And for the first time, we read these letters together. And what happened was, in the 1950s, there was a young seminarian from Canada that wrote to Dr. Weigle. First he wrote to Thomas Nelson, and they passed the letter on to Dr. Weigle. And he said, basically, I'm not understanding why you've taken arsenokoitai and malakoi and translated it into homosexual, right? So one other little piece of thing, did I say it? The actual translation work on the book of 1 Corinthians, because when I went through the second time, I could find the date on those documents when they translated. They actually translated 1 Corinthians, the team, not in 46, because that's when it was printed. They actually translated it between 1935 and 1937. So it's even worse. What could they have possibly understood about homosexuality, human sexuality in 1935? Not very much. So this young seminarian writes to Dr. Weigle, and he writes an absolutely beautiful letter. And out of all of the paperwork we went through, the second time round, I found one more postcard. I'll read you that first. This postcard was written in 1952. I blew it up, but it's the size of a postcard. It's just a postcard, little postcard. And it was before the entire Bible came out. So it was in March. The entire Bible came out in 1952. And it's from a pastor in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And he says, "Dear sir, having been asked by a parishioner who has a problem of homosexuality in the family as to what the scriptures say about the problem, I discovered sodomites in 1 Timothy 1:10. And on checking in the Greek word, I found it to be the word arsenokoitai, as in 1 Corinthians 6:9. But here you've translated it as homosexual. I wondered if there's a reason that you translated the word differently in both places," which is a great question. Right? It's a great question. So he says, "I see that Dr. Moffat, the guy that wrote the 1913 Bible, used sodomites in both places in 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians. And he says, thank you for your attention to this." I love this. "Probably insignificant point." Probably insignificant. Yeah, it's going to rip an entire group of people apart for the next 60 years. Yeah, more than that. And I'm looking forward to your new Bible. So this was the only other record we found. His response was fairly light. His response basically said, well, this is why I did it. I took the 2 words. I took arsenokoitai and malakoi and combined them up into one word, homosexual. And that was the explanation. The only long explanation we found was the response to the seminarian. And it was a detailed response. And it said exactly why the team did that. which proved my theory of it was ideological and cultural, and they had no understanding as to what the words meant. They translated it. But this young seminarian writes to Dr. Weigle 3 exchanges of letters back and forth. Seminarian to Weigle, Weigle to seminarian, seminarian to Weigle, Weigle to seminarian, and another time. So there's 3 letters each from each of them, and they're in the archives. So I will tell you that, because this becomes important, the letters were written in 1959. Okay? This becomes an important date. So he writes in his first letter to Dr. Weigle, he says, he's disappointed in this translation. He says, "I'm therefore intensely disappointed and concerned about this faulty and misleading translation. I believe that this slip shows a personal prejudice and lack of information on the part of the translators involved regarding the scientific, academic approach to their task in such a way as to render this inaccurate translation. I write this after many months of serious thought and hard work, partly to point out that which to me is a serious weakness in translation, but more because my deep concern for those who are wronged and slandered by this inaccurate usage of the word." And then he goes on to say that he's concerned that misinformed and misguided people, those among the clergy not excluded, who may use the RSV translation of 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 10 as a sacred weapon. So he writes this in 1959. And he ends the first letter by saying, "I write this letter." When we read this together on the screen, I cried. "I write this letter with certain homosexual individuals in mind, Christians who would die for their faith, their church, and their Lord." So he writes this to him. And then Weigle just simply responds. He has lists of what the words mean in the past translations, and he concludes to say, "The term homosexual was used in the RSV was intended by the committee to simply express one compact meaning of arsenokoitai and malakoi. Almost no theology behind it. Yes, they looked, as we did, at what the words had meant in the past, but catamite and sodomite, those are old words, and no one knows what they mean, so we came up with homosexual. And besides, those were the words that were used in Moffat's Bible. Moffat was on the team. We didn't want to use Moffat's words because then we would have been slanting towards what Moffat had done. So their best solution was to come up with the word homosexual. The only other person that objected to the usage of this, so now listen, we've been through 60,000 sheets of paper. He subscribed to a clipping service. Remember clipping services, if you're old enough? So newspapers would clip, and they would put the newspaper on top, and someone that was subscribed to a clipping service, that clipping service would, every few weeks or every week, send them all the articles that appeared on their topic. So Weigle subscribed to several clipping services, so anything that came up in the news about the RSV was cut out of the newspapers and mailed to him, and believe me, all put in these archives. Everything was put in this archive. When this Bible came out, there were 1,500 vigils the night before praying for this Bible, but there were just as many people that protested this Bible. And why did they protest this Bible? They protested it because the fundamentalists got up their hackles because Alma in Isaiah, in 1952 version, where Alma had been translated as Mary as the Virgin, now they went to a more accurate translation of a young woman. And they needed Isaiah to say a virgin because it was going to say in the New Testament she was a virgin, right? So they needed this confirmation of prophecy. And another so the fundamentalists were saying that the RSV team is taking away Mary's virginity. Yeah, that's a stretch, like 1,900 years later, take that girl's virginity away. And then the other problem, I found, the second time I went through it, I could slow down. I found 37 pages that somebody had written to the translation team about the word reed, as a measurement of a reed. 37 pages this guy invested in the definition and how long a reed was and how the translation team got it wrong. Invested 37 pages of his life in this. I mean, it was like, is it truly, is it verily, all these topics. And besides that postcard, this one major letter saying, I have a problem with this word homosexual. That was shocking. But what it gave us was exactly what we were looking for as the explanation. Okay? We needed an explanation. We were pretty despondent that we weren't finding it. We were finding all kinds of evidence that said, we're not dealing with this, but we couldn't find the exact explanation. So when we found this letter, we were very excited. And then a couple of months later, and I'm going to come back to the letter, a couple of months later, I was reading my copy of the 1955 Western Civilization and Homosexuality by Derek Sherwin Bailey. I think that's the proper title. I read these odd books. Yeah, Homosexuality and the Western Christian Tradition, published in 1955. Derek Sherwin Bailey is an interesting character. He was an Anglican priest. He looked at the English laws against homosexuality, and he said, these don't seem to be fair. There had been 5 very high-profile arrest cases on homosexuals in England. Sir John Gielgud, who was known to be one of the most famous Shakespearean actors, and Alan Turing from The Imitation Game, right? They say that Alan Turing, because he solved the Enigma machine, that he probably saved 1 million lives and shortened World War II by 2 years. He was a brilliant man, but he was a known homosexual. So they started injecting him with estrogen. They took his knighthood away, and they started doing a conversion on him. So there were these very high-profile cases, so Derek Sherwin Bailey did the work. I kind of do the approach he does. He got some historians, some lawyers, some theologians, all kinds of people together and said, let's look at the real history of this word and the history of homosexuality and criminalization and see if we can come up with something better. Because it seems that we're using the morality laws explicitly against 2 groups of people. And who would those 2 groups of people be? Female prostitutes and homosexuals again. So these morality laws were about all kinds of sexual immoralities, but it was never about heterosexual adultery. It was about female prostitutes and homosexuals. So Derek Sherwin Bailey, in this book, he writes in his Homosexuality in the Western Tradition, this is the only other record during the time that I found where somebody complained about this translation. He writes, he says, paraphrase, and then I'll get you his quote. He says, the word homosexual, the Bible says nothing about homosexuality. He says there's absolutely nothing about it. But then he directly says, unless this, I writes this in 1955, unless this error is corrected and the true meaning of the passage is explained, the wide circulation of this version and the reputation which its general merit has for it may only serve to encourage intolerance and to perpetuate a great social injustice, thus seriously discrediting the Christian church. So he gets in 1955, the Bible says nothing about homosexuality, and you just made it say something about homosexuality. So in effect, all we found during the entire period, and I word searched everywhere, Derek Sherwin Bailey says something about it, but he just comments on it. He doesn't have an explanation. This pastor from Canada comments on it. He gets a poor response back. But thank God for the seminarian. So we were so curious as to who this seminarian was. So I am not going to give you all the details because I'm trying to protect the story still. And I'm trying to protect where the story lay, because in the book, I want to present the narrative around this. If I just published the letter and what it said, and you don't have the entire timeline and foundation of what people understood, you could take your 2010 mind, your 2018 mind, lay it on this letter, and come out with a completely different spin on it than I do. But mine, I'm telling you, is accurate because it's foundationally strong. So we're protecting parts of the story. So that night that we found it, I had a Facebook friend, and she was 2 hours north in Rhode Island. And she said, if you ever have time for dinner while you're there, would you invite me down? So we made a pot of chili, and Tina came down and had dinner with us, as did, I'm fangirling Dr. Dale Martin, who was a New Testament scholar, gay himself, very well known on this stuff. Great book, Sex and the Single Savior. The best chapters I've seen on arsenokoitai and malakoi. They came over for dinner with us, and of course, happened to stay that we found this letter. So I said, we'd be so curious to know what happened to this guy. Tina calls herself a professional do-gooder, and she does a lot of ancestry work. So I said, I'm going to trust you with some information. Got to keep it confidential. I'm looking for this guy. Can you find this guy? Because as I'm writing the book, I want to know who this guy is. 10 months went by. Every couple of months, I would give her a reminder, like, okay, Tina, I'm writing the book. You got to find the guy. So couldn't find him. Thursday morning, I woke up to an email. And in the email, the headline of the email says, I'm almost 100% sure this is your guy. So she sends me the circuitous route that she found him in. Oh my goodness. There is the story of how she found him. I will tell you this. When he wrote this letter, he wrote under his first and second name and did not use his last name. So all we had was a person's first name, his second name, his P.O. box, and where he lived at the time. That was a challenge. But through a very circuitous route, Tina found him. So I had who he was, and on Thursday morning, and he was alive. And on Thursday morning, out of the blue, I called him up. Hello. My name is Kathy Baldock. I'm doing research on the RSV. Please don't hang up. You know, because my mother would have hung up on me by now. I mean, not me, but, you know, who the hell are you calling me? Buttercup, she's a New Yorker. She says those things. And so, hi, tried like encouraging. So I said, I'm writing, I've been doing research on the Revised Standard Version. Yes. I said, I found a letter written 59 years ago. Yes. So I said, here's what the letter says. Let me tell you why the letter's important. It is the only documented proof we have historically of someone complaining about this translation. But more importantly, it's the only document we have in history saying why this team translated that word in 1946. Nothing else is written about it. Nothing else is written about it. So we've all accepted that it's always been. But this man writing this letter forced Dr. Weigle to explain over 3 letters why they translated it. And it was not theological. So we had the proof we were looking for. So then I stayed on the phone with him for an hour and a half. I've got another appointment booked with him on Thursday. He doesn't have the letters anymore. I sent him copies of letters from the archives. He said, it shouldn't have been very difficult to find me. All you had to do was go here and here and here. And I said, but you didn't use your last name. Oh, I didn't? He said, that was quite a bit of sleuthing, young lady. You betcha, handsome. So I can't say too much about his story because I want his story. And when I heard how compelling his story is, I'll tell you these about him. He became a minister. He knew he was called at the age of 16 into a denomination. And he said, there is absolutely no way. So he was born in the 30s. I'm going to be speculative about some of this, or nebulous about some of it. Speculative. I know the answers. When he was 16, so in the late 40s, in the mid-40s, he knew he was called as a 16-year-old to serve God as a minister. But he also knew in the late 40s he had two issues. He was both gay. He knew he was gay. It was a gay man that wrote the letter. We speculated that, but we now found out he was gay, and he stammered. He had a severe problem with stammering. So he said, how could God possibly call a gay man who stammers into the ministry in the 40s? So his pastor knew there was a call on him and offered him when he was 16 years old to take the pulpit on a Sunday night. He lived in a particularly rural area of the country, Canada, where there was no TV yet. And so they still did church on Sunday nights. So the pastor said to him, when the choir, because of course he was in the choir, when the choir goes off, you follow me to the right side of the stage, and you sit beside me, and you're going to preach the message tonight. And he said, then being gay wasn't the problem, being a stammerer was the problem. But he kept hearing his spirit say, his spirit was saying, yes, I'll do it, but his brain was saying, how could God possibly, I mean, you've heard this story in the Bible, how could God possibly call a person that doesn't have perfect speech, stammer, Moses, right? And so he gets up, terrified, opens his mouth to speak at the microphone, and never stammered after that. And he said, if God could heal me of my stammering and chose not to heal me of my orientation must be okay with God. Right? He wrote this letter when he was 21. It is the only record we have in history of anyone challenging them and getting an answer. Anyone challenged them, but they got an answer. So here I am, Thursday morning. Hello. Don't hang up on me. And I said, I have this letter that I found in the archives, 59 years old. Well, did you ever show this to anybody? Did you ever show this letter to anybody? No. Did you ever show the answers to anybody? No. Do you have a copy of this letter? No. Have you discussed this letter with anyone? Has anyone ever asked you about the letter? No. No one has ever asked this man about this letter, and he's the one that produced the record. And in this third letter, he says to Dr. Weigle, I think this is really an inaccurate translation. A more accurate translation would be those who practice sexual perversions. And Dr. Weigle says, when we revise the Bible, we're going to think about that. And they did. It was this young man that caused the RSV to be translated from homosexual to sexual perverts, which is not great. I mean, you know, but heterosexuals can be sexual perverts. Not me, of course. But heterosexuals can be sexual perverts, and it's more accurate. People that are using and abusing sex. But, so I have an appointment to speak to him Thursday, sent him all the letters, so he's gonna read that and see what he remembers about the circumstance. This man served X decades in the ministry as a minister, thinks himself a very humble, forgotten pastor, and I want his story desperately because it showed that God did something with a young 21-year-old stammering gay man that's important in history. So before I end for the night and we do some questions, in the Interpreter's Bible is a commentary, and it was written in 1953. And the RSV team gave the working copies of the translation to Abington House, which is a very conservative Presbyterian publishing house, so that they could write a commentary on the verses. And in this commentary, in 1953, yes, in 1 Corinthians it says it's about homosexuals, so they reinforce it. But in Romans, they also add homosexuals, which was not in the RSV. So now this commentary Bible in 1953, in the commentaries, adds the word homosexual. So the researcher says, what did previous Abington Interpreter's Bible's commentaries say? So I went to my local library, University Library, local libraries don't have the copies of the 1929 Abington Press Interpreter's Bible. And I went through all the clobber verses. I said, what did the commentaries say on Corinthians, Romans, Leviticus before? The way 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10 was interpreted, commented on, was the people that won't get into heaven, membership in the redeemed society, people that won't get into heaven, membership in the redeemed society is impossible for those who practice idolatry or the shameful vices of the Gentile world. So once again, it's associated with idolatry, first of all. So this excess in idolatry, absolutely nothing about homosexuality. Did they know what homosexuals were at this time? They didn't know what they were, but they were certainly appearing. But even the commentaries Bible changed after the RSV changed. So that was surprising. And then there is a passing commentary in a 1956 book called The Principles and Practices of Preaching by a guy named Ilion Jones. And he makes a very short commentary that says, before you do your sermons, pastors, please make sure that you see what the Bible words actually say, because all of a sudden they could change, like the RSV did. And he says, I used to preach Corinthians 6, 9 through 10 of, the people that have these excesses. He said that he preached the word effeminate in there as, he saw it as the easy and soft road people take through life. He didn't see it as anything having to do with homosexuality. That's how he'd been preaching it in the 50s. So in these hundreds and hundreds of letters we found, and newspaper articles, front page papers, people were saying all kinds of things about the Bible, and no one seemed to notice, no one except very few exceptions, right? Seemed to notice this word homosexual was in the Bible. It just was not important. The Bible was dismissed by a lot of people because the fundamentalists didn't like it. They had all kinds of terms for this Bible. The New Standard Perversion of the Bible, the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, posed, opposed, and exposed. Whose unclean fingers have been tampering with God's holy Bibles? So there were people up in arms and praising this Bible, but not noticing this word homosexual. So tomorrow night, that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with what was happening in the culture that people didn't seem to notice this unbelievable change in the Bible that was going to be used as a sacred weapon, that was a very unfortunate thing, said Derek Sherwin-Bailey. What was happening in the culture that people just didn't seem to put effort into understanding this? So here's where we're going tomorrow night. We're going to start with the RSV again. We're going to do a very fast capsulization of like what human sexuality looks like, but interpretations of human sexuality. We're going to start at the RSV and say, why did the culture seem to ignore this Bible? This word in the Bible, homosexual, why didn't they notice it? And then we're going to cover these topics, and they're all connected. Persecution of gays in the 40s and 50s. What was the therapeutic understanding? Did the therapeutic community start to understand sexuality a little bit better? You hope they did. They did. What were pastors saying about homosexuality in the 50s? What were they being told to do with homosexuals? The beginning of the gay rights movement. Then we're going to hop back into Scripture, because that's going to bring us to the 70s. And in 1971, homosexual is going to end up in the Bible again in Romans 1 for the first time, and Leviticus. But what did we understand at that point? Then we're going to look at more modern translations and what they do with those words in Leviticus and Romans. Then we're going to look at the history of fundamentalism, the rise of the religious right, the creation of theology around homosexuals, because there's no theology about homosexuals, certainly, when they're doing the translation work. But these guys over here are going to go back, like God bless Robert Gagnon in 2001. He writes an over 500-page book on the theology of homosexuality, whereas 20 years before that he couldn't have, because there was no theology. And we're going to look at the reparative therapy and the beginnings of that in the Christian movement, because obviously when it's going to get depathologized as no longer a mental illness, why does it get picked up in the Christian movement and as something that needs to be fixed? And then we're going to look at all these verses in modern translation, asking a basic question that I asked myself, which started this whole thing. As we understood better about human sexuality, did we do better with Bible translations? So I'll tell you we did okay until about 1980, and then we went off the rails. So come back tomorrow night, and there you go. Thanks.